This is a map of the 2020 election results in Oklahoma. In this election, Joe Biden received about 32% of the vote, while Donald Trump got 65%, winning the state in a landslide fashion. While some states are certainly redder than others, Oklahoma is uncharacteristically Republican for its general build. In 2020, it was an average of 26.6% more Republican than the states it borders, and this includes already Republican-leaning states like Arkansas, Missouri, and Kansas. Additionally, Oklahoma does in theory have potential for Democrats to succeed. It has two fairly large cities in Oklahoma City and Tulsa. As a percentage, it is actually 3% less white than the nation as a whole. So, all of this begs the question, why is Oklahoma, of all places, so red? The best place to start when dealing with Oklahoma is learning about the Democratic coalition. Since there are only around 6 Democrats in the entirety of the state, this will be pretty easy. But in all seriousness, considering Democrats are outnumbered nearly 2-1 in the state, it is actually easier to get a feel for where their votes are coming from, especially since there are so many fewer to deal with. Now, if we go back to our 2020 election map, you can probably get a decent understanding of where it is without even, saying anything. The biggest blue dots on the map are here and here. As you can probably infer, these are the two biggest cities in the state. This one in the center is Oklahoma City, and the one in the northeast is Tulsa. There are also some smaller cities that are noticeable on the map as well. This city directly south of Oklahoma City is Norman, which is where the University of Oklahoma is located. This city in the south is called Lawton, and this city up in the north, kind of in the middle of nowhere, is Stillwater. But aside from that, there's not really much blue to be found on the map. Sure, there are a few blue precincts sprinkled throughout blood red rural areas, but they're tiny and only net Democrats a couple hundred votes. Plus, they're immediately canceled out by neighboring red precincts. So, really, the only Democratic parts of Oklahoma are the cities. Everything else is red. And this is where things get interesting. For reference, let's compare Oklahoma to a generic competitive state. In 2020, the best example of a competitive state was Pennsylvania, as it was the tipping point and it was broadly considered to be the most important state in the country. Pennsylvania was also a key battleground this year, so I think it's a good reference point. We're going to contrast Pennsylvania and Oklahoma county by county to see where the disparity is, since, again, Oklahoma's deep red, while Pennsylvania tends to swing back and forth and is generally more representative of the country as a whole. So, for starters, Pennsylvania's biggest urban county is Philadelphia County, home to, as you can probably guess, the city of Philadelphia. Biden won Philadelphia County by around 63 points. Now, in contrast, Biden actually lost Oklahoma's largest county, Oklahoma County, by just over 1%. This means that Philadelphia County is 64% bluer than Oklahoma County. You'll see a similar story when comparing the two second biggest cities as well. Pittsburgh is Pennsylvania's number 2. In the county it's in, Allegheny, voted for Biden by around 20 points. The Oklahoma equivalent of this is Tulsa, but it voted for Trump by 15. That means that the Pittsburgh-Tulsa difference is around 35 points. So while not nearly as big as the Philadelphia-OKC difference, still a really big deal. Now, before anyone comments anything about this being an unfair comparison, I think that's actually a fair comment, and I'm aware of this. Philadelphia is not Oklahoma City, and Pittsburgh is not Tulsa. But when talking about politics in Oklahoma, these are the closest things you'll get to fair benchmarks, and they do illustrate the massive difference that exists between Oklahoma and other states. Now, let's talk about the rural areas, which are kind of just cities, but for Republicans. Now, since comparing each and every rural county would take way too long and would make the video even more boring and generic than it already is, we're just going to add them all up and see the margins. So, when calculated, the counties in rural Pennsylvania gave Trump a combined 39-point lead over Biden, which is quite formidable to begin with. But they pale in comparison to rural Oklahoma, which gave Trump a shocking 57% lead over Joe Biden. To put that in perspective, that's more than he won any state in the 2020 election by, including states like Wyoming. Now, let's look at the suburbs, because the suburbs tend to be the biggest battlegrounds. The largest and most influential suburban county in Pennsylvania is Montgomery County, which sits directly north of Philadelphia and voted for Biden by over 26%. The Oklahoma equivalent of this is Canadian County, which is the collection of suburbs to the west of OKC. Now, not only did Canadian County vote for Trump, but actually voted for him by over 43%, which again is a massive difference and a far cry from the 26-point margin Biden had in Montgomery County. So, to sum up, the Oklahoma urban counties are about 50% redder than the Pennsylvania urban counties. The Oklahoma suburban counties are about 69% redder than the Pennsylvania suburban counties. And the Oklahoma rural counties are about 18% rarer than the Pennsylvania rural counties. Those are just some pretty insane differences, but to truly understand them, we have to know why they're happening. And the answer to the question that we're asking here is actually the answer to the question that the video in general is asking. And it lies in the demographics. So Pennsylvania and Oklahoma are fairly similar states when you look at their racial makeups. Oklahoma is 64% white, Pennsylvania is 75% white. Oklahoma is 8% black, Pennsylvania is 12% black. Oklahoma is 12% Hispanic, Pennsylvania is 8% Hispanic. The only significant difference in terms of the ethnicities in the states are Native Americans, where in Oklahoma they make up nearly 10% of the population, whereas in Pennsylvania it's just 0.4%. But again, aside from that, the states are really similar. So you can't really just peg Oklahoma's Republican tendencies solely on white voters because, again, as a percentage, it's not, even that different from a swing state like Pennsylvania. But you can talk about the way white people vote because that's where the difference lies. In 2020, Trump won white voters in Oklahoma by 43 points, but he only won them in Pennsylvania by around 15. This proves that the average white voter in Pennsylvania is a lot more liberal and open to voting Democrat than the average white voter in Oklahoma. Now, unfortunately, we don't have data for how black and Hispanic people voted in Oklahoma, but we do know how much they turned out. And in Oklahoma, they combined for only about 10% of the votes cast, despite making up a combined 20% of the population. So, really, when you look at the population of Oklahoma, they may be a fifth of the population, but they only made up a tenth of the electorate in 2020, meaning that they just did not turn out as much. In Pennsylvania, that same dynamic exists, but to a much smaller extent. Black and Hispanic voters made up 16% of vote counts, despite, again, combining for about 20% of the population. So, in Oklahoma, Republicans clearly benefit from white people being very conservative, in addition to low turnout from black and Hispanic voters. Now, the final wildcard here are the aforementioned Native Americans. Unfortunately, we do not have data for how Native people voted in 2020, but we can make inferences. And the interesting thing about Oklahoma Native voters is that they are known to be very conservative based off of precinct data. Now, again, looking at one precinct and making a broad generalization about a demographic as a whole is generally not the best way to go about demographic analysis. But seeing as there are no exit polls available for this, looking at individual precincts is kind of the best thing we can do here. Although, again, I would caution against making any broad statements solely on this. So, in Oklahoma, the three precincts that were the most Native American based on percentages voted like this. Precinct A was for Trump by 66%, Precinct B was for Trump by 60%, and Precinct C was for Trump by 54%. Again, all those numbers, 66, 60, and 54, are actually more Republican than the state as a whole, meaning that judging off those three precincts, Native voters in those precincts actually voted to the right, or more Republican, than the state as a whole. Again, all these precincts are above 70% Native, so in these specific areas, these voters were solidly Republican. There may be other precincts where it tells a different story, but when you look at the most Native precincts in general, they do tend to lean very much towards Republicans. This reflects the conventional wisdom about Oklahoma, too. Their current governor, Kevin Stitt, is a Republican who does actually hail from the Cherokee Nation, and Republicans have traditionally received endorsements of Native leaders within the state, so that's probably part of the cultural aspect of Native voters voting red in Oklahoma's elections. So that was a lot of information, and I know that a lot of this stuff, like examining exit polls and precinct data, is pretty tedious, but I do want to put a bow on all of it by recapping my conclusions based on the research I've done here. So, first of all, as we know, Oklahoman cities and suburbs are significantly more Republican than the average city or suburb. We also know that Oklahoma's rural areas are redder than your average rural area, although the discrepancy is not as big as the ones that exist in the cities and suburbs. The reason that these areas vote the way they do is simple. Number one, white Native voters are just really conservative in the state. And number two, turnout from Democratic groups like black and Hispanic voters has just been really low in the state. And while there is potentially a bit more to the story, I think that these two things are the main reasons why, as asked at the beginning of the video, Oklahoma is just so stubbornly Republican.